Do you remember from last week that we started on membrane potentials?
Yes.
And I started to tell you that every cell in your body is set up like a battery. And inside your cells, you have a lot of negative charges. I know you don't remember that because that was after the exam and nothing stuck after the exam. So we're going to go through it again, and maybe you still have your notes from last week and you could quickly take those out and review some of the words that I started to introduce. I'm going to do it all over again today, all over, but a little bit more quickly. Last week we learned about membrane transport for probably the fourth time in your academic history, right? Diffusion, primary active transport. We even talked about in the PhysioX the different types of transports. Well, now I'm going to tell you about a set of experiments performed by two scientists with the last name Hodgkin and Huxley, and they experimented on the giant squid, which is the picture that I'm showing you up on the screen. And they picked the giant squid because the neurons were large enough where they could actually stick electrodes into them, probes, if you will, sharp needle-like metallic probes. And I need to tell you about electrodes and membrane potentials because probably in the next 2 weeks or so, you're going to be doing a whole bunch of EKG analysis. And you're going to be dealing with electrodes just like they did. The only difference is you're not going to be sticking them and impaling them into each other's chest. You're going to be putting these electrodes on each other's wrists and ankles. So we need to start with their experiments before we can morph into the EKG experiments that you're going to be doing. There is a lot to cover, although it is a short PowerPoint. There's some really big concepts that you're going to be carrying with you for the rest of the semester. We learned last week about cell membranes being semi-permeable. They were selective. Some things they allow through more readily than others. We talked about gases being very permeable across the cell membrane. We talked about how some things need a channel to get through. We started to talk about what could open a channel. Remember the ligands? And voltage-gated channels. Well, we're going to talk about voltage-gated channels a lot this week. Not only do you need to worry about the sidedness of the cell membrane with respect to chemicals. You know that there's more sodium outside of the cell, more potassium inside. Those are chemical gradients. But now you need to know about electrical gradients. Separation of charge. Which side of the cell membrane is more negative? Which side is more positive? And can that change? Can chemical gradients and electrical gradients work together? Can they oppose each other? And the answer is yes to both of those. Today, we're going to start talking about these big concepts of electrical gradients. How many of you have taken a physics class? Yeah, most of you have not. Was it a year's worth of physics classes or a semester? A year? So if you've had a year, do you remember the third semester out of that year where you started talking about electrical potentials? That's what I was expecting. If I say resistance of a circuit in parallel versus in series, and you start having issues with, oh my gosh, do I add up all the R's or is it 1 over R and then I add them up? Well, guess what? We're going to be talking about circuits in series and parallel. Our neurons are that way. But we don't have to approach it from such a very physical science approach, we can take a step back and say, how is this going to work for me as a future healthcare provider, right? Because you're not going to be calculating resistance for a patient, right? You're not. So I'm going to reteach it to you, but from the standpoint of why do you give a rat's whisker, talking about current, resistance, and voltage. Those are all scary words when you're in physics, but you know what? They don't have to be scary. I can morph that into, here's what I care about as a future healthcare provider. This is what I need to know. What you need to know is, first of all, the inside of every single living cell in your body is more negative than the outside. Why? Lots of reasons why. But I want you to know 3 big ones. 3 big reasons why. Number 1, not necessarily in this order, I'm just going through the list. The inside of your cell, your cells are filled with proteins. That makes sense. That's where gene expression occurs. And because, excuse me, of your pH, your proteins are negatively charged. So the inside of your cell being very filled with negatively charged proteins, that's one contributing factor. Number 2, you have this thing called the sodium-potassium ATPase. We know what that does. It pushes out 3 sodium for every 2 potassium it pulls into the cell. It requires ATP to do this. It's our best, but not our only example of primary active transport. It is creating chemical gradients, but it is also electrogenic. What does that mean? Well, stop and think. What charge is sodium? +1. What charge is potassium? Also +1. 3 sodium go out, 2 potassium go in. Is this equal exchange of particles? No. We have a net loss, right? Is it equal exchange of charges? No, it's not. You have a net loss of a positive charge. And if you lose your positivity in life, what do you become? More negative, of course. Of course. I like to say, if attitude is everything in life, it's best to pick a good one, right? It's best to pick a good one. That's easier said than done some days, especially when a damn mockingbird wakes you up at 1:36 in the morning. So if we have 3 positive charges lost for every 2 positive charges we're bringing in, we have a net loss of positivity. That means we have a resulting negative inside the cell. Now, the number 1 reason why, and that's what I have to prove to you today, the number 1 reason why the inside of your cell is negative is because in the cell membrane you have potassium leak channels. Now, I didn't call them pores. If you remember last week, I was very nitpicky. I said a pore is something that is open all the time. And I said a channel is a pore that could be regulated, opened, closed. Now, the term potassium leak channels makes a student think that these are open all the time. So why don't we call them potassium leak pores? Because in Unit 3, I'm going to tell you that in some cells, they regulate these leak channels. They can shut them down on occasion. So if you draw a circle on your piece of paper to represent the cell membrane, and draw your sodium-potassium pump. Remind yourself that the inside of the cell has more potassium. then draw these leak channels, draw them open, that are specific for potassium. You know, there's a reason why we talked about that Physio-X last week on membrane transport. You learned that channels or transporters were specific for a type of chemical. And we even added other chemicals in the mix, and it didn't change anything for them. Remember when we played with the glucose transporters? And we added albumin, I think it was? Didn't change anything. Remember when we had the sodium potassium ATPase that we were playing with, and we added glucose? Didn't change anything. So these potassium leak channels, they are specific for potassium. And because potassium is found more abundantly inside the cell than outside, if these channels are open, which way will potassium want to go? Out. Why? Why? Down its chemical gradient, right? Down its chemical gradient. Well, we need to explore this idea of the inside being negative a little bit more, because chemical gradients and electrical gradients could be opposing each other, antagonistic to each other. And I'll just put this little nugget inside your head. If potassium is leaking out of the cell down its chemical gradient, that's a loss of a positive charge, isn't it? And that means the inside becomes even more negative. But electrical gradients, if I can make the physics simple for you, opposite charges attract. So if potassium is leaking out and it's plus charge, causing the inside to become more negative, shouldn't potassium want to go right back in? Shouldn't it be attracted to the negativity inside the cell? And yet it's still leaking out. And right there, that should tell you that the chemical gradient is outmatching the electrical one. Well, hello, Kara. This is already so complicated. You said you were going to make the physics a lot easier. Well, I said I'm just going to put this little nugget in your brain. I need some time to explain it to you. We need to talk about current. Electrical flow of charge is current. And there is an equation that we're going to use for the rest of the semester. Congratulations. This is your first introduction to Ohm's law. Where are my physics people? Do we remember Ohm's law? No. Because you've been abused and you're trying to forget that abuse. You need therapy. Ohm's law is right here. It's actually not that scary. It means if you want an electrical current, you need to consider two things. You need a separation of charge, and you also need to recognize that the current is inversely related to resistance. Hey, that was a lot I just told you. I'm going to break it down. You want flow of charge, you need to consider two things. Do you have a gradient? This is not new. You want net movement of a chemical or water. What did you need? You needed separation of that chemical. You needed a gradient, didn't you? So if you want current, an electrical current to flow, you need separation of charge. You need a gradient. You need an electrical gradient. You need one side to be negative, one side to be positive. This is not new to you. If you wanted diffusion, you needed a gradient. You also needed permeability, didn't you? Well, if it's not permeable, could your solute move? Even if there was a gradient, if it wasn't permeable, would it move? No. That's where the resistance comes in. If resistance is high, what's your flow going to be like? Low. They're inversely related. Okay, let's add the scary terms then. Current, I, the I in Ohm's law, current flow. That's the movement of charge. Charge leaving or entering the cell. Movement of charge across the cell membrane. If you have a net movement of charge, it doesn't matter if it's plus or negative, you've got an electrical current. It's no different than the electrical current coming through the outlet when you plug in your device. It's no different. When you drive home today, you're going to get to a stoplight. It's going to be a red light. Chances are you're not going to get all green lights all the way home. You're going to have a red light, and when you're stopped at that red light, I want you to use your big boy, big girl terms. I'm being met with resistance. I cannot conduct myself through what? No, what do you call that? The intersection. I'm being met with resistance. I cannot conduct myself through the intersection. Can't. I'm being met with resistance. When the light turns green, what are you going to say? Now I can conduct myself through the intersection. I don't have any resistance. I'm going to flow from this spot to that spot. And I want you to think of yourself as a charge, plus or negative, depending on your mood. Probably positive. Glad I'm out of physiology today. I'm going to conduct myself as far away as possible. What kinds of resistance could a cell membrane have? Do you remember those gated channels I told you about? Voltage gated, ligand gated. Well, if the gate is closed, can a charge flow through it? No. Then there's resistance. And if you have high resistance, according to Ohm's law, you're not going to have flow. Neurons are excitable cells because they allow charge to flow. They can conduct an electrical current. And I'm here to tell you, we can detect that. We have the machinery in this classroom right now to detect that electrical current. It's not just neurons. Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, even some glands, they're allowed to have an electrical charge. Is this charged? Is this charged? How do you know that? Well, how do you know it's charged? It's working. If it weren't charged, what would happen? It wouldn't work. We use these ideas every day. My damn cell phone's not charged. Why are you so mad? Go plug it in. Why are you so mad? My honey, my cell phone, my battery's not charging. So he took my battery out of my phone, put it in his phone. Now, of course, it works. I have the bad battery. Why are you so mad if your phone is not charged? You can't do something with it then, right? You can't text people. You can't post to Facebook. And I don't really care what you're eating for lunch, just so we're clear. Arguably, you could put that away for a day. Try it. So worried when your phone's not charged. My phone is dead. If there is no electrical current, you can't do work. That's what you said. It's not working. Electrical events precede mechanical. You want to do work with your body, you need electrical current. It's no different than plugging in your laptop and your phone into the outlet to charge things up so you can do work with it. It's no different. You want to move your body? You need an electrical current first. Electrical events precede mechanical. You want an electrical current? You've got to open those gated channels. You've got to make resistance go down, not up. Resistance goes down, you get more flow. If you have more separation of charge, even better. That's like having a bigger chemical gradient. Do you remember when I was telling you about simple diffusion? I had a picture of a slide. And I asked you, what would happen to the kid going down the slide if the slide had a steeper slope? That kid's going to go down even faster, right? Okay, that's your gradient. You want more electrical current? Have a good separation of charge and reduce the resistance. That's all according to Ohm's law. Now in physics, you had scary language. You learned about voltage or voltage potential or potential difference or voltage difference. They used all these different words, and all it is separation of charge. They all mean the same thing. Separation of charge. Sidedness. Our cell membrane has sidedness. Inside of the cell is negative. I told you the big 3 reasons why. We have separation of charge. We have voltage potential across our cell membranes. That means we have the potential across every single cell in your body to have an electrical current. Just let the charges flow. But not every cell in your body has this ability. They're all set up like a battery. They have the potential. They have the separation of charge. But only excitable cells can tap into that. Why? Why only them? Why only neurons, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and some glands? Why them? My favorite 2 words in the world, gene expression. They turn on genes that code for proteins that insert through the cell membrane. Those are called integral proteins. There's a reason why I went over that last week. And those have gated channels in them. And something's going to make the gate open. These excitable cells can actually tap into the electrical current because they can open the gates. And if you have an electrical current, then you can do work, just like you're doing on your laptops right now or your phone. But only specialized cells in your body can do that we call excitable cells. Resistance. Anything that will oppose the motion or movement of a charge. The gate is closed. Red light. I want you to say that when you go home. I cannot conduct myself through the intersection because I'm being met with resistance. I have a red light or I have a stop sign. And then the word conductance means just that you have charge moving. I want you to say that. Oh, green light. Now I can conduct myself through the intersection. You're allowed to move. Scary language. Not that hard. Just break it down to what it is. When you are dealing with things that are charged, you have got to ask yourself, just like you asked yourself with chemical gradients, now we're dealing with electricity. Anything electrical, separation of charge, you have got to say to yourself, is there a gradient? Do I have separation of charge? Where are the charges? Is it more negative inside? More negative outside? Where are they found if they're separated? Is my membrane permeable to these charges? Can they conduct themselves through the intersection we call the cell membrane? Or is the gate closed? Red light. Because if the gates are closed, then there's high resistance. And according to Ohm's law, then that means we're not going to have good flow. We also need to keep into the mix chemical gradients. Why? You all know by now that there's more sodium outside of the cell. There's more potassium inside of the cell. We've been talking about those things. Those are chemical gradients. But they also have charges. They also have charges. So if the chemical is allowed to flow, it's also going to mean that there's a charge flowing. And that means we have an electrical current. Which way are the charges moving? Is there a chemical gradient that will oppose it? These are questions you have to ask yourself. And you know what? I'm only going to give you 4 to remember. You ready? Write these down. 4. Can you remember 4? Last week, my anatomy class had their bone test. Do you remember that? Do you remember how hard you thought that was? Don't you kind of want to go see my anatomy students and go, really, bones? Let me tell you what we took last week. Enjoy it while you can, you might say to them. There's a reason why I hide some of my anatomy office hours away from my physiology office hours, because if you all show up when a sweet, young, innocent anatomy student is like, I need help with origins, insertions, and actions, you are like, bitch, really? Just you wait. And yet you thought it was so hard back then, didn't you? You remember all those origins, insertions, and actions you had to learn? I think I can give you 4 chemicals to remember. 4. Now I know you're capable of remembering 4, because we went through anatomy. The 4 I want you to remember. Ready? Sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride. 4. 4. Draw a circle on your paper if you're taking notes. I'm going to add to your responsibility. Those 4 I need you to know. First responsibility, where are they most abundantly found? Where do we find potassium? Inside. Woo, nailed it. Got that one done. Sodium, where do we find it? Outside. Good. We got 2 out of the 4 done. Chloride. Oh, that's a new one. It is outside. Most abundantly found outside. Chloride. Calcium. Most abundantly found free, we need to say this, free outside. I need you to know that calcium is abundantly found inside cells, but not free. Usually it's sequestered. Do you know what that means? The jury has been sequestered. It's like in lockdown, right? You all are sequestered right now. So calcium can be found very abundantly inside cells sequestered in organelles, like the endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria. The question I want you to keep in your head is, where is calcium most abundantly found when it's free? Outside. See, that's an important distinction. Outside. Okay, next thing you are charged with. And it's funny, because you need to remember the charges of these. Sodium has what charge? +1. Potassium has what charge? +1. Chloride has what charge? -1. And calcium? 2+. Okay, so where are they most abundantly found? What charges do they have? And next, if suddenly The cell membrane is permeable to those chemicals. Which way would they want to move for their chemical gradients? For their chemical. If suddenly sodium has more permeability, which way would it want to move? Inside. If it's more abundantly found outside, it would want to move in. Yes, this is why we're playing the game. Chloride, which way would it want to move? Inside the cell. Down its chemical gradient. Agreed? Calcium, which way would it want to move? Inside the cell. Down its chemical gradient. Potassium, outside. That's why potassium does diffuse out of the cell through leak channels. Okay, let's play the game again. Which way would these chemicals want to move with respect to their charge? Knowing that the inside of the cell is negative and opposites attract. Sodium, inside the cell. Oh, no, are you telling me its chemical gradient and electrical gradient are working together? Funny how that worked. Calcium, inside the cell. Oh, its chemical gradient and electrical gradient are working together, aren't they? Chloride. It wouldn't want to go inside, would it? So you're saying its chemical gradient and electrical gradient are antagonistic to each other. Potassium. It would want to stay inside. Its chemical gradient and electrical gradient are also antagonistic to each other, aren't they? Dang it! Kara, when am I going to know which one's bigger than the other, which one's winning? Oh, my young Padawan learners. You're going to quickly see that the cell membrane can change its gating, can change red light to green light, and you will see that for these electrolytes, that's what these chemicals are called. Why? Why are they called electrolytes? Because they have charge. And when they move across the cell membrane, they create electricity. That's why we call them electrolytes. That's why in nursing, in medicine, we're worried about a patient's electrolytes. Why? Do we want the battery dead? Because if the battery's dead, we're going to say our patient is also dead. We're worried about electrolyte balance, and we're going to be dealing with electrolytes from now till the end of the semester. And if you're going into healthcare, for forever, you have to deal with these. I need to tell you which force is winning when. It's actually not that hard. Most of the time, the electrical and chemical are going to work together. So I need you to know at this point, every single living cell in your body has a membrane potential. And potential should not scare us anymore. It simply means separation of charge. You should know at this point which side of the cell is negative, which side of the cell is mostly positive. You should know by this point why the inside of the cell is negative. The three biggest reasons. They are not the only, but they're the big three that I test on. How negative are cells? Remember our number line? This is started with, remember zeros here? All the digits to the right are positively charged. Remember that? All to the left, negative. How negative are your cells? The number most textbooks give you is -70. But you need to know that's an average number. So I'm going over here, -70 millivolts. Some cells can be more negative. Some cells can be less negative. It's just an average number. The number itself isn't important. It's why that is the most important thing to know. Three big reasons why. Negatively charged proteins. The sodium-potassium ATPase. Number one reason, potassium leak channels. That's the most important of the three. Why is it the most important? Why is it that simple diffusion of potassium leaving the cell, when you all just told me that potassium electrically would want to stay, not leave? Well, if it's diffusing out, then which force is winning for potassium? Chemical. The chemical gradient is winning. Will it always? Well, that's where I need to teach you some more scary language, something called the Nernst potential. Nernst equilibrium potential. Scary language. So really scary once we break it down. So membranes are going to become leaky. We're going to see gated channels. Red light, green light. The question is, at any given time, if I say, poof, suddenly the membrane is more leaky, more permeable to this electrolyte, you need to tell me which way it will move. That means you need to know its chemical and electrical gradients. Which way would it want to diffuse? We call that the diffusion potential. Is the chemical gradient going to win? Is the electrical gradient winning? You're going to be able to tell me the diffusion potential. So here we have a cell shown here in blue, and I'm showing you in a different shade of blue, blue-gray, ions that are negatively charged. I am going to insert an electrode. Do you see that? I'm going to insert an electrode. And that electrode is attached to a battery. And when I insert that electrode and it's attached to the positive side of the battery, I'm going to insert a positive charge. And the question is, you see all these negatively charged chemicals? Which way will they want to move? Into the cell, right? Towards that positive charge. Well, okay, they're moving. Do you see them moving? When will they stop? When will they stop? That's our timer, right? Okay, I got you. Let me finish this slide and then we'll pause. Thank you for your work. Sorry, I was just having a party in my head. A Lady Gaga song just came into my head. Be in charge, the charge. I was having a party, stupid party. Anyway, when will the charge stop moving? When the chemical gradient opposes it. Do you see all those negative charges getting too crowded inside there? That's a chemical gradient now. That's like you going into a very crowded party. Dude, I don't want to go in there. There's too many people in there. I like all the people. It's too loud. Are you that person? I'm that person. I will actually not enter a restaurant if I feel like it's already too crowded and loud. The loudness, the cacophony gets to me. I don't like loudness. If I'm going to a restaurant with people, I want to be able to have a conversation. And not talk like I live on a mountain to have this conversation. So when the chemical gradient is equal in strength, but in opposite direction to the electrical gradient, we say that ion is at its Nernst potential, or Nernst equilibrium, or equilibrium potential. Let me say that again. There's a point where these negative charges aren't going to want to keep going into the cell because it's too crowded. The chemical gradient is going to favor them to go out. When the chemical force and electrical force are equal but opposite direction, we say that ion is at its Nernst potential. If this orange strip represents the cell membrane, this ion is like, I want to go in because it's positive, but it's too crowded. I want to come out, but yet I'm attracted to the positive, and it's straddling the cell membrane. No net movement one way or the other at the Nernst potential. And each of those 4 electrolytes I asked you to know, each one has its own Nernst potential. These are numbers. I don't want you to memorize them. I don't want you to memorize them. But you will see after you weigh your little dialysis bags, you will see examples of these Nernst potentials for at least 2 out of those 4 electrolytes that I'm going to go over. But right now, let's take a pause and finish your experiment. None of that was on video, which is good. That's fine. You can record it. I have cousins that watch my YouTube channel because they're nurses. They're like, I hire these new nurses, and if they don't know their stuff, I make them watch all your videos. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry to those nurses. No, it's so important. They don't remember their electrolytes. So it's a training video for some nurses. We left off talking about the Nernst potential. Moving on with that. Nernst potential, equilibrium potential, it's when the chemical and electrical gradients are equal in force but opposite in direction. That means there is no net diffusion potential. It's neutral for both of them. All right, I gave you the big 3 reasons why the inside of the cell is negatively charged. And I said the most important one was the potassium leach channels, where potassium is diffusing out of the cell. Right now, you should, if you've been paying attention at all, you should be saying to yourself, wait, we just went through this. Potassium's electrical potential means potassium should want to stay. Why is it still leaving? And I said, because the chemical gradient is still larger than the electrical. And right now you should be saying, well, how did you know that, Kara? Well, let me go through Nernst potential all over again. What is Nernst potential? Where the electrical gradient and chemical gradient are equal and opposite in direction. Clearly potassium is not at its Nernst potential, is not at its equilibrium potential. It's not because it's still diffusing out of the cell. Okay, let me prove it to you. Let's see that in action. Let's see it in action. Sorry. Let's see it in action. And why does potassium get all the glory? Why isn't it sodium? Are there sodium channels that are leaking? Yeah. Well, then why isn't it sodium, Kara? I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to you. We can go through all 4 electrolytes that I gave you, but I think just showing you 2 is enough for you to get the idea. So how is it that simple, passive diffusion through leach channels can cause the inside of the cell to be negative? And why is it potassium and not sodium? Just to give you 2 out of the 4 electrolytes. Okay? Let's start with potassium. Which way does it want to move chemically? Out of the cell. Okay, so let me give it permeability. Did you see that? I have to give it permeability. And you all said it would want to move out of the cell. Okay, but when would it stop moving out of the cell? When would it stop? Oh, we forget. Remember about 2 slides ago, I showed you a cell where I inserted an electrode and I said I'm going to put positive charge inside the cell, and you all said the negative charges would be attracted into the cell, and I said until when? Until it got too crowded. meaning the chemical gradient, opposed any further entry. Well, you know what? It can work in reverse. We can have charges leaving the cell, not entering. I just showed you an example of entering. Well, when would potassium stop leaving the cell? Clearly wants to diffuse out down its chemical gradient, but every time that's a positive charge leaving, what's left behind? Negative. And pretty soon that positive potassium leaving the cell is going to be like, but I'm kind of attracted to the negative. I'm torn. I want to go out, but I'm attracted in. When that happens, potassium would be at its Nernst potential. See? No net gain or loss either way. Straddling the cell membrane. Can we measure that? Have we measured that in an experimental laboratory? Of course we have. We've done that. And we know what potassium's Nernst potential is. It's minus 94 millivolts. Don't memorize that. Horrible. Just let's go back to first grade on our number line, okay? Where is the cell? Minus 70. What's potassium's Nernst potential? More negative than that. How about that? Let's just more negative. Which means potassium would still want to leave the cell, and as it does that, the inside of the cell would get more negative. When would potassium stop leaving? At that minus 94. Then that means the inside of the cell is so negative that potassium wouldn't want to leave as much anymore. At minus 94 millivolts, that's when potassium's chemical gradient and electrical gradient are equal and opposite. Are our cells at potassium's potential, Nernst potential? Nope. It's a good thing that they're not. Because if it were at the potassium Nernst equilibrium or equilibrium potential, if a battery reaches equilibrium, you no longer have a chemical and electrical gradient. You no longer have an electrical current. If you do not have a net movement of charge, you don't have electricity. If you don't have electricity, can you do work? No. We don't want our patients to be at equilibrium. If we are having a patient at equilibrium, just like a battery at equilibrium, we say, oh, my battery's dead. You're going to turn to the patient, their family, and say, I'm sorry, but your son reached equilibrium. And they're going to go, really? You reached equilibrium? You're going to be excited over that because it sounds good, but really it's, oh, he's dead, right? He reached equilibrium. He finally did it. Break that to your family next time. So my neighbor's grandson sadly overdosed. The opiate issue in this country is a fierce one, and sadly she lost her 26-year-old grandson on Sunday night, which is sad, I know. And I felt like saying, he reached equilibrium. That would be bad. She's a nurse, she would know what that means. It would be very bad. We don't want to reach equilibrium. And I told you that homeostasis does not mean we're at equilibrium. I said it means we have a set point. It's not equilibrium. We don't want to reach equilibrium. We don't want to. Okay, well, why does potassium get all the glory in my list of 3? Why not sodium? Okay, fine. Let's test sodium's Nernst equilibrium. Which way does sodium want to move? Inside the cell. What charge does sodium bring with it? Positive. So sodium had the most membrane permeability, not potassium. Then the inside of our cells would be what charge? Positive. Right there. It's not sodium that has the most membrane permeability at rest. It's potassium. There are more potassium leak channels than sodium channels. I can do this visually for you. Let's say the women in this room are potassium. Let's say the men in this room are sodium. There are more women in this room than men, so I picked correctly. I open the door. The women want to diffuse out. There are actually quite a few men sitting outside. And if you go to different levels, you go upstairs to the chemistry level, there's actually a lot more men. You go downstairs to the physics level, there's a lot more men. It's a weird phenomenon on this level. You have more women. So let's say the men outside, they want to diffuse into the cell. Okay, the women, you get to go out through an open door. Men, you want to come in my classroom, you have to go under the door. Not as permeable, is it? Not as likely. So sodium, it's going to keep coming into the cell until the inside of the cell becomes so positive that sodium now, with its positive charge, would be repelled. It wouldn't want to come in. That's sodium's Nernst potential. Well, what is that value? Plus 61. That's way over here. Way over here. And the resting membrane potential, fancy words to say, what is the separation of charge in cells in your body? Resting membrane potential, meaning when they're holding steady, set point, homeostasis, minus 70. If sodium had the most permeability, then the inside of our cells would be positive, not negative. So potassium wins at rest. It's the electrolyte that wins. But that's at rest. Can it change? Yes, it can. I want you to keep in mind on our number line, right? That's what I've been doing, acting out in our classroom. In our number line, here's our 0. Where is resting membrane potential? Or voltage membrane potential? Minus 70 is what most textbooks tell you, but it's really a range, isn't it? I said minus 70 to minus 90. I picked a different number to put on the screen. Who cares? It's in that range. You should know why, the big 3 reasons why. You should know we're not at equilibrium for any of our electrolytes. If we reach equilibrium, what are we going to say? Well, you're dead. We don't want to reach equilibrium. Now, let's say you want the most electrical current possible. You want the most current possible. Let's just play with 2 out of our 4 electrolytes. Let's just play with sodium and potassium. They're on the screen. You want the most current possible. Let's play with potassium first. Where are we at rest? Minus 70. Boom! You increase potassium permeability. Which way will potassium move? Outside the cell. For how long? Potassium leaves. Potassium leaves. Move me. If I represent the cell potential, the separation of charge, if potassium leaves, where should I move if I were the needle? This way? More negative? Why would it? Potassium's leaving. If potassium leaves, this is why we're doing it. This is why we're doing it. Thank you. Thank you. Now's the time to guess and speak out loud, because then when you hear the correct answer, you're like, in your head, you're like, I'm never making that mistake again. Best to do it now than on the test. Yep. Get it out of your system. So potassium leaves, that's a loss of plus charge. Move me. Or negative. Until when? Until minus 94. That's not a lot. About negative 20 millivolts worth of current. Oh, but if I open sodium channels, move me. Which way will sodium move? Into the cell. Why? Why? 2 reasons. Tell me both. Tell me why sodium wants into the cell. 2 reasons. Opposite charge and chemical gradient. Both are working together. And sodium's like, wait, I get to come in. The doors are open for me. Look how much current is coming through the cell membrane. And it'll keep going until plus 61. But do you think the cell is going to allow it to reach equilibrium? No, something's going to change the permeability. Those are those gated channels I started telling you about. So if you wanted to create the most current, which ion would you give the most permeability to first? Sodium. Oh, great. Now I'm close to plus 61. I didn't reach it. I don't want to reach equilibrium. But now the inside of the cell is positive, isn't it? You want to get back to resting membrane potential. You want to get back to your set point. Now which ion should you give permeability to? Potassium. And it's going to want to leave. Why? 2 reasons why. Why will potassium most certainly now want to leave? Down its chemical gradient, but also same charges repel. Potassium's like, I want to get out of here. So potassium leaves, loss of positive charge, and the inside of the cell returns back toward set point. Oh, so these excitable cells wanting to generate the most electricity for you allow sodium permeability, electrical current, and then reset potassium permeability. That's a lot of chemical and electrical gradients we're tapping into now. Because we did, now we can do work. All that movement I just did, that was skeletal muscle contraction. That's mechanical event. Electrical events must precede mechanical. From now on, when your battery goes dead, I want you to turn to your family and say, sorry, I can't do any mechanical events right now. Electrical events must precede the mechanical events. You're going to have to wait 20 minutes while I charge. And they're not going to have any idea what you just said. When you're at a stoplight, you're going to say, you're being met with resistance. You cannot conduct yourself through the intersection. We have no potential right now. No diffusion potential. No one will know what you're talking about. So our resting membrane potential, that's what VM represents, is close but not at potassium's Nernst potential. Why? Because potassium has the greatest permeability. I want to say something really profound, and you're going to miss it on the test. You're going to miss it. I'm going to say, I have it recorded and videotaped. I told you all you would miss it. Like, no. Raise your hand and volunteer right now, because someone's going to miss it. Who's it going to be? In the night class, it's always the same person that goes, me. It's always Ryan's like, I will. Kara, I'm not going to lie. It's always going to be me. I'm like, why would you volunteer for that? It's like, it's just going to be me. At any given moment, the cell's membrane potential is a reflection of the ion with the greatest permeability. Christopher's sitting here going, yeah, it's on the test. Christopher's probably wondering right now, did I miss that one? I'm not sure. At any given moment, the cell's membrane potential reflects the ion with the greatest permeability. So come on, say that again. Why is resting membrane potential minus 70? Which ion must have the greatest permeability? Potassium. if the cell's membrane potential was plus 50, which ion has the most permeability at that point? Sodium. At any given moment, the ion with the greatest permeability will dictate what the membrane potential is. Yes, Jennifer.
So you're saying that through the leaking, as well as sodium potassium pump, potassium goes out and sodium goes in. And that makes it even negative. But to make it back to its resting membrane, it lets more potassium out. Well, how does the cell ever get back to more potassium inside since something else?
I could just hug you. Thank you. Because you just spring-loaded me into the very next section of our lecture where I explain that to you. You ready? Great question. Jennifer's question basically was, when does this switching of permeability happen? How do we fluctuate one way and then get back toward normal? How does that happen? Gated channels. Crossing the intersection. Sometimes sodium has the green light, sometimes potassium has the green light. Let's play with that. Let's review. She just said we have the sodium-potassium ATPase, more sodium leaving and potassium entering the cell. This is electrogenic. It contributes to the negativity of the cell, but it's not robust. It is simple diffusion that causes the inside of the cell to be negative. Why? We have more potassium leak channels. The sodium-potassium ATPase, though, is still important. It is still hugely important because it sets up these chemical gradients. And that means excitable cells can tap into that. There's a reason why I had to teach you about membrane transport all over again last week. The sodium-potassium ATPase consuming huge amounts of ATP to establish these chemical gradients so that excitable cells can tap into it, so that they can generate an electrical signal, so that then in turn our body can have a mechanical event. So let's play that game, Jennifer. What if, boom, suddenly the cell was more permeable to a certain ion? Which way would it want to move? We have to entertain electrical and chemical gradients. Which way would sodium want to move? Most certainly inside the cell. Down its chemical gradient and also down its electrical gradient. But would that happen indefinitely? No, if the inside of the cell reached plus 61, sodium would not want to come in anymore. It would be at its Nernst equilibrium. Which way does potassium want to move? Chemically, out. But how much would it move out? The cell would go from minus 70 to minus 94. That's not a huge wiggle room. That's not a favorable movement of an ion. Jennifer's question is perfectly timed. When would potassium give us a huge current? So excitable cells are excitable because they have gated channels. These are proteins. Why do they have them? They have unique gene expression. You see it? Gene expression. They turn on genes that code for these integral proteins that happen to be gated. And they have names. Let me tell you some of their names. Sodium voltage gated channels. When the voltage allows them to open, sodium's allowed to move. So if I tell you sodium voltage gated channels open, in your head, that means sodium now has more permeability. And you should be able to tell me which way it would move. If I say potassium voltage gated channels, then that means potassium has even more permeability than usual. And you should be able to tell me which way it would move. Do you think there are calcium voltage gated channels? Yes, and if you're preparing for your quiz on Thursday, calcium voltage gated channels are very important. Marcelo, is that my blood? How rude. That's the other physiology instructor. He's the nicer one with the sexy Brazilian accent. Say something sexy.
Something sexy.
There you go. You can do that. Anyway, if I say calcium voltage gated channels open, then that means calcium is going to be able to move. Which way would it want to move? Into the cell. How would the cell's charge change? If calcium's coming in, that's a +2 coming in. The inside of the cell would become very positive, wouldn't it? So it's about timing, Jennifer. It's going to be down to timing. Timing is everything. Some gated channels are going to open first. Some are going to open second. Some are going to open third. There's a timing to them, a trigger point that gets them to open. So let me tell you about these experiments where we first discovered these gated channels, voltage gated channels. So I told you Hodgkin and Huxley, they inserted an electrode into the giant squid neuron. They used that because this being a giant squid, a very big animal, they didn't need like a high-powered microscope to magnify this. They could, pretty easily insert this electrode. Well, let me tell you about some of the language that we developed from their experiments. Don't let the language bully you. A lot of this we've already talked about. I say membrane potential or potential difference or just voltage potential. All of that means separation of charge. If I say RMP, that means resting membrane potential. What is that number? Around -70 millivolts. Remember our number line? When I say excitability or excitable cells, you think unique gene expression. They have gated channels that they can open and close. When? How? That's what we have to talk about. But because they can open those gated channels, we can have ions flowing. And we're going to select which gated channel opens when. Your job is to know your 4 electrolytes that I gave you. Which way would they want to move? Chemically, electrically. Which way would they want to move? If the cell potential becomes less negative, that's called depolarization. If the cell goes back towards RMP, resting membrane potential, that's called repolarization. If the inside of the cell becomes more negatively charged than normal, that's called hyperpolarization. Polarize, separated. Our country right now is most definitely polarized. And it's just going to get worse for this week. Any of you read the newspaper? Do you know how to read? If the cell is hyperpolarized, more separation of charge, more negative inside, and it goes back to normal resting membrane potential, that is also called repolarization. I'm going to get someone on the exam with that question. Who volunteers? I'm going to ask you, it's in your homework packet as well. On an action potential curve, tell me where the cell is repolarizing. And there should be 2 answers. I'll explain in just a moment. So there's this thing called threshold. Threshold is a unique term for probably a lot of you. You seem like a very nice person. I enjoy you sitting in the front row. but I am going to kill you with my gun. Okay? Another reason why our country is polarized. But because I like you, I'll pull the trigger slowly. Why is that funny? Same effect. Have any of you shot a gun? Have you ever fired a gun? Have you? Have you seen someone shoot a gun? Have you watched TV where people have shot guns? You know there's this thing that I have to pull called a trigger, right? Okay, I love this argument. Guns kill people. No. No, they don't. People kill people. Someone has to pull the trigger. I can't put the gun down on the table and go, shooter, go ahead. I'm allowing you. It's like saying knives kill people. Really? If I had a knife and put it on the table, I could stab her. Those people. So if you've never shot a gun before, I can tell you the first time you shoot one, it's pretty nerve-wracking. Why? Why? Because some of them are more powerful than others. We have a whole bunch of guns, and it terrifies me that I like my little 22. My little 22 I can handle. There's not a lot of kickback. There's not a lot of force from it. I like my 22. The other ones, I don't like them. It's too powerful. And when my honey, he's like, you gotta learn how to shoot these. You need to know what they feel like. And I'm like this. Yeah, I'm scared. And he'll put his hands on my hands and hold them. And I feel better about that. But I'm always like this. And I'm pulling the trigger like, yeah. Because you don't know when you're going to hit that point where the bullet comes out. It fires. You don't know what the trigger point is. And each gun has its own unique trigger point. That's why it's important that you go to a safe gun range and you practice so that you know how much you have to pull the trigger before you're going to get that kickback. There used to be, it's not so much popular now, there used to be these cars called stick shift. Anybody else drive a stick shift at one point? Okay, going from one car to the next with a stick shift, what'd you have to do? What'd you have to do? You had to use the clutch, but you would figure out the timing of it, right? And sometimes you're so used to your car that you let up on the clutch before the gears are engaged, and then the car's like, bam, bam, bam. It's a little scary. When was the first time you drove a stick shift, if at ever? Oh, my honey is hilarious. Bought a new car, stick shift. I knew the idea behind stick shift. I know the gears and how. I would watch people drive them. I understand 1, 2, 3, 4, then reverse. I had that idea. Dealership. We both came together in a car. Honey goes, here are the keys. Drive home. You should have seen the pizza delivery boy when I came up behind him going, because I was learning the timing of the gears. I was white knuckling the whole way home. I think I stayed in first gear the whole way home. It's terrifying. Same thing with shooting a gun. There's a trigger point. Well, we don't say trigger point when we talk about voltage-gated channels. We say there's a threshold. I got to figure out the threshold of this gun. Threshold means it is a change in potential, scary language again, a change in charge enough where voltage-gated channels will now open. Trigger point. Each voltage-gated channel has its own threshold, trigger point. Think of them as different kinds of guns. Sodium voltage-gated channels have their own threshold. Potassium voltage gated channels have their own threshold trigger point when they open. Calcium voltage gated channels have their own. Get the idea? Yet in a textbook, you'll read threshold is minus 55. That's what they'll all tell you. Minus 55 millivolts. Where does that look like on our number line? This is minus 70. Minus 55 is a 15 millivolt change. Say about here. I'll say minus 55. I'll call bullshit. Each voltage gated channel has its own threshold. So why are textbooks picking minus 55? Because sodium has the earliest, if you will, voltage gated channel to open. It opens first. You only need about 15 millivolts worth of change, and sodium voltage gated channels open first. So, if sodium suddenly has permeability, what will sodium do? Go into the cell. Move me. Move me. If I'm on the number line, shouldn't I go less negative, more positive? And somewhere around here is the threshold for potassium voltage gated channels. Somewhere around here. Textbooks never write about it. They never do. I don't know why. They should. Because if potassium opens around here, then what? Move me. What if sodium voltage gated channels are still open? What if they're both open? Jennifer, this goes to your question. It was brilliant. Okay, what if they're both open? Next question should be, are some more open than others? Quantity. Are there more sodium voltage gated channels open than potassium? Because if there's more sodium, then move me. And I'm going to say it again. At any given moment, a cell's membrane potential is a reflection of the ion with the greatest permeability. Numbers win. And Hodgkin and Huxley, they discovered that with their very simple experiments. And I'm going to show them to you. And you will do a Physio-X where you repeat them. Here is the giant squid axon. Here is the stimulating electrode. You've seen this already on another slide. The stimulating electrode is going to insert a charge. You saw me do that when I told you about the Nernst potential. So their stimulating electrode is going to insert a positive charge. Downstream along the axon, they had 3 recording electrodes. These recording electrodes were hooked up to a machine that could actually detect the current moving across the cell membrane. And this is what they did. Here's the plus charge being inserted. And they waited and they said, what are our recording electrodes going to detect? And they inserted just a little bit of plus charge, and what they detected was, see, they moved it from minus 70 to minus 65. As I was saying before in class, this is pretty much the setup of the Hodgkin and Huxley experiments. They inserted a stimulating electrode, and then they had 3 recording electrodes. And those recording electrodes were set up to a machine called an oscilloscope, and they were able to detect if there was a current moving from the stimulating electrode down along the axon. So in their first try, they just did a little bit of a positive charge inserted into the axon. They moved the resting membrane potential from minus 70 to minus 65 millivolts. And what they detected was yes, some of this positive current did get recorded all the way down to recording electrode number 3, but this current dissipated with time and distance. Then they tried it again. This time they gave a larger stimulus and they depolarized the membrane to about minus 60 millivolts, shown here in the orange-reddish tracing. And again, they detected this current traveling along the axon, and this current was bigger than the last one, the last experiment, but it still dissipated with time and distance. So then they got the cell membrane up to minus 55, and at that point, this is what they saw. They saw a reproducible all or none electrical event. This all or none event was much larger than the stimulating current, and it did not dissipate with time nor distance. So Hodgkin and Huxley, they said, well, at start, that minus 70 millivolts is called resting membrane potential, or RMP. Those earlier attempts where the current dissipated with time and distance, they called those local potentials or graded potentials. And the all or none event that was reproducible along the cell membrane was called action potentials. They repeated the experiment and they brought the membrane up to minus 50 millivolts, thinking maybe that electrical event, that all or none, might have a greater magnitude. But it was still the same magnitude or size with the current. So it didn't get any bigger. Once this all or none event occurred, it was reproducible along the cell membrane, even if there was a larger depolarizing stimulus. So no higher, same magnitude for that electrical current. This picture is similar to the one that you have in your homework packet. And you can see on this tracing that there were 3 attempts to get the cell to reach threshold. And remember, threshold is a lot like a trigger point on a gun. Threshold is basically the amount of membrane potential change required to open voltage-gated channels. A lot of textbooks call threshold minus 55 millivolts, a 15 millivolt difference, less negative, more positive from the minus 70 resting membrane potential. However, I want my students to know that every voltage-gated channel has its own unique threshold value. This minus 55 gets all the glory because that's when sodium voltage-gated channels open. But again, each voltage-gated channel has its own amount of membrane potential change required in order to get them open. So again, threshold voltage is the minimum voltage needed to trigger an action potential. I don't want my students to remember a number. Rather, I want them to know it's the trigger to open voltage-operated channels. An action potential takes roughly about a millisecond. Your neurons can fire thousands of these reproducibly in a second without disturbing the chemical gradient that they rely on, meaning sodium outside the cell and potassium inside the cell. If we compare local potentials to action potentials, local potentials, they reflect the shape and size of the voltage stimulus. They are graded, meaning bigger stimuli will lead to bigger depolarizations, but they die out. They dissipate with time and distance as the voltage moves away from the site of stimulation. Action potentials, however, they don't really reflect the shape or size of the stimulus. Rather, they are uniform in size. They are always identical. They can't, meaning the magnitude is the same. In class, I use the example of a gun. If you fire the gun repeatedly, the bullets are discharged with the same force every time. It's an all or none event. If you reach threshold, then you're going to get these action potentials.
If you're below threshold, you're going to have a graded or local potential. They do not diminish in size no matter how far from the stimulus. They regenerate at each point along the axon. Now, what is responsible for this change, this reversal of resting membrane potential from very negative to very positive? Although it's called an action potential, you need to remember it does not require primary active transport. There is no cellular ATP consumed for this event. When the voltage gated channels open, it is a passive event. This is simple diffusion. This process is dependent on the electrical chemical gradients that we talked about in class. We need sodium more abundantly outside the cell and potassium more abundantly inside the cell. What establishes those electrochemical gradients? It's the sodium-potassium ATPase that helps establish that. But remember, in class you learned about the big three reasons why the inside of the cell is negative. The sodium-potassium ATPase is hugely responsible for the chemical gradients, but it's only mildly electrogenic. The number one reason why the inside of the cell is negative is because of the membrane's potassium leak channels, giving potassium more permeability. Excitable cells have a fickle cell membrane potential. They can change this membrane potential by changing permeabilities, and we practice that in class. In class, I said your responsibility is to know your 4 major electrolytes, know where they are most abundantly found, know which way they would move if suddenly given more permeability, and what would happen to the charge within the cell if these ions moved. Why are excitable cells able to change their membrane potential? They have unique gene expression. They turn on genes that code for these integral proteins that you see here on the screen. And these integral proteins have gated properties. If the gates open, then the ions get to flow. Simple diffusion down their electrochemical gradients. This is a slide you've seen before. We talked about these gated ion channels in class during our membrane transport discussion. We know that some gated channels open because of a voltage change. That's what we've been talking about a lot in this lecture. And if the voltage change is sufficient enough, then these gates open and ions can flow. We also learned that there are some gates that require a chemical to bind to them. These are called ligand-gated channels. When the ligand binds, as shown here, then again, ions are able to flow. These gated channels are different from pores. Pores are integral proteins with a lumen or a middle part, like a tunnel through the cell membrane. And pores, even though they're open all the time, they are still very specific for a given ion to flow through them. Ion channels are the ones that allow this action potential to occur. The permeability of an axon membrane to ions is determined by the number of open channels. Whatever channel type is open the most, then the membrane potential is going to be represented by that ion. For example, I'll say it again differently. At any given moment, a cell's membrane potential is a reflection of the ion that has the most permeability. So if you look at this picture, you can see in purple the actual action potential, and in red and blue below that, we see the conductance of sodium and potassium. If you look carefully, sodium and potassium voltage-gated channels are open at the same time, at one point on the action potential, like during the upstroke. They don't open at the same time, but at a certain point on the action potential curve, they are open at the same time. So notice the difference in my sentence. They don't open at the same time, but there are places on the action potential where they are both open. And yet we see on the action potential curve the upstroke occurring. Well, if sodium is coming in and potassium is going out, both of them carry a positive charge, and yet the membrane potential is becoming very positive. What can we say? Which ion clearly must have the greatest number of open channels? And that would be sodium. When we see the downstroke, why do we see the cell returning to a negative value? Well, clearly the potassium voltage gated channels now are more abundantly open. So we're going to talk in the next lecture about conducting states, gated properties, if you will. Are these gates open and allowing the ion to conduct through the channel, or are they closed, which is a non-conducting state? Please remember that when these ion channels open, they are basically having a preference for a certain ion. So if I say sodium voltage gated channels, I want my class just to think only sodium is going through. Potassium gated channels, then I want you to think only potassium is going through. It's not really that way, but it's close enough, and for testing purposes, I just want to make it very clear in that regard. Calcium gated channels, only calcium goes through, and you get the idea that these channels are very specific to their ion.